So what I did was I dug holes in the gravel about the size of flower pots and planted these herbs in those holes. And then I covered the whole thing in sand so that I wouldn't get more weeds. So I weed this once a year, and it takes about 5 minutes. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I'd wrap a video around answering a viewer question. So viewer Califragilistic Bear, I'm not going to read the thing verbatim, but the gist of the question is that she's building in a raised herb garden. She wants to grow sage, basil, rosemary, garlic, lavender, maybe tomatoes. And she's got some critter issues, and just wanted to know, where should she get started? What's the first step? And how to deal with, I think, what was the critters she was talking about? Possums, squirrels, crows, some other thing I can't read my own writing here, raccoons. So the first advice, so basically these are questions from a person who doesn't have a garden, that wants to have a garden and wants to get started. And I love those kinds of questions, and I love hearing that someone wants to have a garden. That's just great. So the first thing I would say, first advice I would give is there are bubbles. Some children must be blowing bubbles somewhere because a bubble just flew over my garden. There's bubbles floating in the air. How delightful. So the first advice I would give is I wouldn't have a raised bed. If I could, if you want to have a box garden or whatever, that's fine. Put your garden in a box if you think boxes look nice and you want to spend money on wood. But the plants don't care about your garden. And raised beds in particular, I'm sort of mystified at this fad. And I don't want to go on a rant here, and I certainly don't want to beat up on the person that, everyone that makes a garden these days is making raised beds. And whenever someone asks me where I work, oh yeah, you're good at gardening, I want to make a raised bed. I'm like, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to have a raised bed? The plants don't care. If you went back to the 70s when I was a kid, and a lot of people had gardens, in my neighborhood, a lot of people had gardens in their backyard. No one had raised beds. Everybody had, my parents had fantastic garden in the backyard, and their parents had fantastic gardens, and no one was doing raised beds. And it offers no advantage. It's just a fad. It's a fad. They look nice. We like our boxes, right? And it's neat and it's tidy. And there's a handful of a couple advantages to a raised bed, but those advantages come with disadvantages. The main disadvantage, what's the one thing plants need more than anything else, aside from sun, is water, right? Water. And what are you doing when you put your bed up? When you plant something up, right? Above the ground, right? You're moving. The higher your bed is, the further your plants are from the ground, right? The water's in the ground. Especially, I think this person lives in L.A., Los Angeles. So water must be an issue there. It's hot there, right? So I don't use raised beds here. These look like raised beds, these boxes that are around me here, but they're not. The soil might be. I guess technically they are because the soil level is a little bit above ground, but. This box here, this is made with 2x8s, the one I'm sitting on, and the soil level is this much above grade, above the ground. So it's raised 4 inches, right? And the only reason I built them this way is because it was sort of a quick way to get a garden. I had a free source of aged horse manure, and all I did with these boxes is I put the box down, I put cardboard down. This was all weeds here. This whole area was a field of weeds, every kind of weeds you can imagine. So I just put cardboard down, I put aged horse manure over that and planted in it. And that's how I built my garden, so I didn't spend any money. And I also, at that point in time, I really hadn't learned about hugelkultur. Once I learned about hugelkultur, every new bed I've built since I learned about that, I don't even bring the horse manure in. I use a hugelkultur approach. You check out my videos on hugelkultur or someone else's, and learn about that technique. You basically, cut the sod off, dig up the soil, dig up about 2 wheelbarrowfuls worth of soil. Put some rotten logs in the ground, anything rotten really, but rotten logs and other biodegradable materials. And then you put the sod back sort of upside down, and then you put the soil on top of all of that. And the grass and the sod dies, all the stuff that you've thrown in that trench just slowly biodegrades over time, and the worms eat it, and they move around and distribute the nutrients throughout your soil. And also all that rotten wood and material that's in the trench that you've dug holds water really well. So in a place like LA, that would be really important. I don't irrigate any of these gardens. Once you have a raised bed, a lot of people have those soaker hoses, drip hoses, irrigation systems and stuff like that. I don't use any of that stuff because I'm using the irrigation system that everything, I'm pointing this way because there's a forest over there. I'm using the same irrigation that forest uses. No one ever waters the forest, right? Everything's growing in the ground. Nothing's growing in a raised bed there, right? All the water's in the ground. Every time it rains, the ground's basically the water is stored in the ground, right? So that's the best place to have your plants growing. Look at that! I just saw a whitefly land on one of my kale. I guess it's whitefly season. Not a problem for you because you're growing an herb garden. My first advice would be don't go very high. You know, if you must have a box, and boxes are nice, I wouldn't go very high. You're just going to have to fill. The higher the boxes, the more stuff you got to bring in to fill it, right? So, and you're working against gravity, right? The water's in the ground. Keep your plants near the ground, and you won't have to water so often. That whitefly is laying eggs on every single kale in my garden. Anyway, it's bothersome. That's my first advice. Don't go very high. Second advice is I wouldn't have a lot of faith in buying your soil at a garden center. The soil from garden centers is usually terrible. They'll say it's the greatest thing in the world. Also, don't get advice from people in garden centers. They're salespeople. I mean, for the most part, I'm sure they're all nice people, but a lot of them are salespeople. You know, never get advice from a salesperson. I'm not selling you anything here. So, and also, you know, as a gardener, as you develop as a gardener, when you have questions, I mean, a lot of people go on YouTube, and that's useful. But if you want a good answer, you go to any. If I have a question about something, I'll say like tomato wilt or tomato. What's that called? End rot, right? End rot's a problem with tomatoes. I would type tomato blossom end rot, and then I type the word extension, and chances are you'll get an article published by a university extension, you know, by a botanist or by a biologist or by a horticulturist who works at the university, not a salesperson, not some, you know, guru or you know, moron on YouTube or whatever. Really, the actual person that does this for a living, that, you know, has a reputation, that you know, other people are gonna. It's probably been reviewed before it's been published, and it's published by a university. So they're not trying to get hits. They're not trying to get, you know, that's the best place to go for any sort of information on questions you have about gardening, aside from watching maritimegardening.com. But yeah, that's where I go, right? I don't go really anywhere other than that. And I tend to gravitate to, in terms of YouTube content, I tend to gravitate towards people that use those resources to guide their gardening for the most part. So that's another little piece of advice just to a new gardener. They said you want to have sage, basil, garlic, rosemary, lavender. So that's a lot, and this person just wants to make one 4x8 garden. That's a lot of stuff you're not going to have much of that. I mean, one 4x8 garden probably wouldn't, I don't know if that would provide me enough herbs, especially with all these other things in here. But anyway, it's a lot of things for one garden, but, you know, sure, that's a good place to start. I would identify which herbs among the ones you've listed are perennial and which ones are annuals. Because the perennials are going to come back every year. You buy them once and they just come back every year. So like from that list that you gave me, sage is a perennial, rosemary is a perennial, I believe lavender is a perennial too. Rosemary isn't a perennial where I live because it gets too cold in the winter. You have to put it in a box and that sort of thing. But you know, it doesn't want to. I think it's a zone 8 perennial or zone 7 perhaps. I'm in zone 6, and my rosemary almost always dies, which is a shame. Anyway, identify which ones are your perennials and put them somewhere where you're not going to forget where they are. So you don't, like, if you're mucking around with the soil in the spring, you don't dig them up by mistake. So I would put your perennials maybe in the corners, right? The sage in one corner and rosemary in one corner and so on and so forth, right? And your sage will get big. Anything that's a perennial is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger with time. So like one sage plant produces a hell of a lot of sage. I mean, it's like a bush eventually, right? I'd put those maybe in the corners. I'd put your tomatoes down the middle. so you can sort of put everything else around them. Depends on how much tomatoes you want, I guess. Yeah, your basil is an annual, so you're going to plant that and it's going to grow. You're living in a great place for growing basil. Garlic, I can only speak to my context. I don't know what options are available to you where you are, but here I plant hardneck garlic. I plant them in October, September, October, and then they pop out of the ground in the spring, and the garlic scapes start forming sometime in July, and then you can start harvesting the garlic shortly thereafter. So you plant garlic in the fall, and you got to remember where you put it, right? So you don't dig it up by mistake. So yeah, wherever you, garlic's a good thing to plant a lot of things with, because garlic doesn't cast shade. So you could pretty much plant it anywhere in the garden, because it makes spikes, right? It doesn't shade out the other plants, so it's a good neighbor for a lot of other kinds of plants. And it depends on how much garlic you want to grow. I mean, I on a typical season, I have 3 4x8. Right now I have 3, slightly more than 3, maybe 3.5 4x8 beds of just garlic. And that's around 250 garlic that they're growing. Anyway, you space them out and you can put other things in with them. They're an excellent neighbor for other kinds of plants. And also, whether you use just a box like this or hugelkultur or whatever, you're going to want to have everything, identify some source of mulch. If you keep your garden mulch, maybe 2 or 3 inches of some sort of thing, rotten leaves, grass clippings, straw, hay, really anything that will slowly biodegrade over time. That mulch will feed the worms and other organisms that are in your soil. Those organisms will, move around and poop in your soil, and that is your fertilizer. So you don't need to fertilize your soil. So if you use a mulch, you're not going to have to fertilize your soil. You're not going to have to water way less often. You'll have a lot less weeds. There's a lot of advantage to keeping a mulch on your soil, and I would recommend that. If you're a new gardener, right? So probably a lot of these, certainly the perennial herbs, I wouldn't bother trying to plant them from seeds. I just go to a garden center and buy the transplant and stick it in the ground. It's just quicker, right? Especially for a new gardener. Certain things grow better from seeds, but most herbs, if you want a quick, sort of a quick fix, most of the perennial herbs I have, if not all of them, were initially bought as transplants, because it was just quicker. $3, it's perennial, so who cares if you spend $3? That thing's gonna grow for years and years and years and years. So it's not a big deal spending $3 on a transplant if it's gonna come back every year, right? Another really good thing to plant in your herb garden is lovage. I'll show you that later in the video too. I think I've talked enough. Why don't you come with me and let's look around the garden here, and I'll give you some pointers. Here I've got a garden that's against a south-facing slope, and you'll notice that I've got kale growing in the garden. But if you look down at the where's my finger? Yeah, if you look down around the edge, I've actually planted herbs in the edge there. So I noticed there was all kinds of weeds growing in that crack. So I thought, well, if there's weeds there, why don't I just put weeds I like there? So I've got, I think over there is savory, and I've got some different kinds of thyme, lemon thyme, I believe. Got different kinds of oregano, and so on. There's a whole bunch of oregano. That variety over there seems to come in really early, at the end. Anyway, my point is that I don't even have here. Let's look at the oregano, because it's so it's growing so well. The reason I'm showing you this is not to say that you should do this in particular. I'm trying to illustrate the point that herbs are not demanding when it comes to nutrients, right? This is just growing in a crack on the edge of a garden, not even in the good soil, right? It's just in my walking path, and this nice big oregano looking great. It's happy here because the wood behind it collects heat and sun, and the oregano likes the heat. So nice big fat happy oregano plant. Here's a good example of what I'm talking about, where things are growing at grade. So this bed is not raised in the slightest. It's got a little, I like to identify the walking path. So in my garden there's places where you walk and there's places where you don't walk, and you don't walk in the garden bed. So every bed has some sort of border. I love rocks because they're free, but this bed is at grade, right? It's not raised in the slightest. It's just at grade. And you notice all my gardens have some sort of mulch on them. But I've got garlic growing here. It's almost 2 feet high now. But you'll notice I have a couple kale and different things. Not on purpose. I just, when I'm moving my plants, I tend to start all my seeds under domes or in the cold frames over there, right? And then when it gets nice and warm, I move them out. And once I've filled one of these like 4x8 beds, I have to find other places to jam the extra plants. So kale garden is a great place to jam extra plants. A lot of people say that kale will prevent pests from eating your plants. I've never experienced that in the slightest. These kale will be attacked by slugs and whitefly and flea beetles just as much as my other kale. That's been my experience. The garlic don't seem to deter any pests whatsoever. But they are good neighbors because they don't shade out the other plants, right? So if your garlic are spaced out, each garlic is about, I don't know, 8 inches apart. There's plenty of room for other things to get jammed in there. Also, the garlic roots are much deeper than the kale, for instance, at least at this stage of the kale's development. The garlic will all be pulled out of here by some point in August, and that's when the kale's largest, right? So the kale will sort of take over the garden. So garlic are a great companion, but you got to plant them in the fall. so you probably missed that one. What else do I have? I wanted to show you out here. So you were asking about critters, and you can see here. My garden has a fence, and it has a fence because I've got a lot of critters, and there's things I grow outside the fence because I'm not worried about critters bothering those things. Critters. So you have a list of things in your things you want to grow. None of the things you've listed here are things I have found any sort of critter to like. They don't eat herbs. And I got an herb garden in my driveway. There's always rabbit prints, bear prints, coyote prints, porcupine prints. Then those are all deer prints. Right? Those things walk right through my herb garden all the time. I'll show you that in a second. And they never ever eat the herbs in the herb garden. Garlic is certainly garlic, onions, things like that. Generally speaking, are herbivore proof. They might take a bite, but they don't like it. So here's my herb garden. I hope the wind isn't too bad here. This is a windy spot on my property. This is the south side of my house, and this was just gravel, and I noticed there was always weeds. So what I did was I dug holes in the gravel about the size of flower pots and planted these herbs in those holes. And then I covered the whole thing in sand so that I wouldn't get more weeds. So I weed this once a year, and it takes about 5 minutes. And that's all it takes, is most weed seeds, they just can't germinate in the sand. Right? The sand doesn't hold enough water. So, these herbs are not growing in sand. Right? They're growing in soil. But they're almost like they've been mulched with sand. In a sense, it's like a rock garden because sand is just teeny tiny rocks. So it's like a sand mulch. And the only reason I'm showing you this, and also you notice it's not raised, right? These are growing there's a little box around it. It's just some extra wood I had, and it's also just to keep the garden distinct from the driveway for shoveling and stuff. And it looks nice, and I just had the wood lying around anyway. But it's just to give you a sense of how minimal the requirements are for herbs. So that's oregano, that's sage there. That's another kind of sage, 2 different varieties of sage. One's purple and one's just regular, white sage or whatever it's called. There's some, I think that's savory, and more oregano over there. And I've got, down the end here, I've got rosemary, and this parsley plant. I also grow parsley in with my tomatoes, and I've got basil growing in with my tomatoes in the garden as well. So yeah, that's my herb garden. Not a raised bed, doesn't need to be. If you want to do it, fine, but you don't need to. If you're doing it because you think you need to, I guess that's my point. If you're doing it because you think you need to,
you don't. Right, so there's no need to have a raised bed. And you can see these plants are doing just fine. And all I do, because so all my other gardens are mulched with some sort of organic material, and that's the fertilizer. Certainly, I don't think these plants are getting anything from that sand. So the only nutrients they're getting is what exists in the soil that's underneath the sand. And also I'll pour compost tea on them once a year. It's not even really compost tea. It's like I just take a bunch of leaves and grass and stuff like that, and rake it up and throw it in a bucket and fill it with water and leave it like that for a week, and then pour. It stinks. And I pour that on them. I do that early in the season because I don't want it. I mean, now I'm going to eat these, so actually, I didn't even do it this year, to tell you the truth. I like to do it every spring before they start growing. I don't want to pour that nasty stuff over these. These haven't gotten any sort of boost this year at all. And look how healthy they look. They look fine, right? They're doing great, and they don't. I didn't fertilize them or anything. They're just getting their own. They got a nice, sizable root base, and they can just find the nutrients they need. I mean, eventually I would assume they would need something, but anyway.
I hope that answered all your questions. I don't think any of those pests are going to want anything to do with any of the things you're intending to grow, so don't worry about it. There's things that critters do like. Certain kinds of greens they like, generally speaking, they like the same kind of greens you like. with some exceptions, like they like, I noticed deer like beans. They actually like the plant, the greens. They'll eat the whole thing. But anyway, those things you listed, those animals that you listed, I don't think any of them will want anything to do with your herb garden or your tomatoes, at least in my experience. I don't have possums here, so I can't speak to them specifically. I don't know about possums, but I certainly have raccoons here, and I've got squirrels and deer and porcupines and so on and so on. Now I've got a fence. I've got this fence to keep those things out. When they get in, they just eat the whole damn garden. So I don't like them. But other than that, the most important thing is the health of your soil. Soil health is everything. If you've got, chances are if you have a lawn, you probably got half decent soil, certainly for herbs. So I would invest a lot of money in soil. Something on me there. Most important thing is to keep your garden mulched. I mean, sure, I showed you an herb garden there where I really don't have a functional mulch, but you want to grow tomatoes in your garden as well, and you want to grow garlic. So you need really good, rich soil to get the best results with those things. So keep your garden mulched, and you don't need anything special for a mulch. You can use leaves, grass clippings, anything, right? Whatever you can get for free that you don't have to drive far to get is what I would use. There's no exotic ingredient that is a magic bullet. So anyone that says there is probably not being honest with you. I use basically all kinds. I use hay, I use leaves, I use seaweed, I even use cardboard sometimes. I just use whatever I can get my hands on. I use grass clippings a lot. Whatever I can get my hands on, whatever's easy to get that I don't have to put a lot of time and energy into getting. Usually on my way home from work, if someone's thrown out a leaf bag, I'll just throw it in my trunk and take it home. And I basically get it all through scavenging. It works great. Keep your soil covered, right? Keep about 2 or 3 inches of mulch on your soil all the time. If you've got some seedlings in the ground, sometimes depending on the seedling, you might want to move the mulch back until it's grown to a certain height. But once your plants are a certain height, you keep your soil covered. And you'll have to water less, you'll have less weeds, the soil will be healthy, the organisms in the soil will be healthy, and your plants will grow like crazy. So I hope that was... sort of went all over the place with that conversation, but I think there were some answers in there. So I hope that helped. If it didn't, give me some more follow-up questions. And anyone else, if they have questions along those lines, let me know. But yeah, that's the theme. You don't need a raised bed. If you like them, that's fine. I wouldn't go very high at all. There's really no advantage to raising the soil level unless you've got a bad back, and then of course you're working against that. And I've got lots of videos on how to use the hugelkultur method. If you're interested in that, just type hugelkultur maritime gardening. You can see them. I'll put a couple links to those at the end of this video, so they're easy for you to find. But anyway, hope that answers your question, and I hope that people found that interesting. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.